Hi, and welcome to my psychological analysis video. This week I'm going to be taking a look at Ted Bundy. Bundy is an American serial killer who killed over 30 women in the 1970s. Bundy is widely considered a psychopath. He's very handsome, he's manipulative, he's charming, he's intelligent. And there's a lot of information available on Ted Bundy, including a recent documentary which contained extracts from taped interviews that he gave whilst he was on death row and whilst he was incarcerated. And these give us some insight into Bundy's dark mind. Often, when you closely examine a murderer's life before they've killed, there are often clues which may be the key to understanding why they've killed. Ted Bundy's birth name was Theodore Robert Cowell. He changed his name later in his life to that of his stepfather. He was born in 1946 to Louise. Ted was brought up to believe that his grandparents were his mother and father. The truth was that his mother was unmarried and his father's identity was never determined with any level of certainty. In an effort to avoid stigma and embarrassment, his grandparents said that they were his mother and father and that his mother was in fact his sister. All friends and family were told that his grandparents were his mum and dad. Ted did find out later that this wasn't the case, and he has since said that he had a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father and for leaving him to discover the true nature of his parentage for himself. During interviews, Bundy spoke lovingly about his grandparents. To the outside world, they seemed to be a happy and loving, supportive family. Bundy had said that he respected his grandfather and that he identified with him. However, it was later revealed to an attorney that his grandfather was a bully and a bigot. He hated black people, he hated Catholics, Italians and Jews. His grandfather would beat up his wife, who was a very timid woman. He would also beat up the family dog and swing the local cats around by their tails. He was even violent towards his own children. One of the daughters was once thrown down the stairs for sleeping in. It's possible that the grandfather had some type of mental health issues because he used to sometimes talk aloud to an unseen entity and would have fits of rage. But despite this, Bundy and others spoke of a warm, loving upbringing which was fairly standard for its time. Louise left home to live with cousins and took her son to live with her. She then met Johnny Bundy and then they married and they went on to have 4 children. Although Johnny did try to include his adopted son in the family activities, Ted did remain distant. Bundy later complained to a girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, that he wasn't very bright and he didn't make very much money. And this began to reveal what he thought of other people. He thought of everybody as beneath him in some way. He saw himself as something better than those who surrounded him. Bundy was a chronic liar and he told different stories to different people. In one instance, he spoke of growing up. He described how he would roam his neighbourhood, picking through rubbish bins in search of pictures of naked women. However, when he spoke to another person about this, he explained how he looked at detective magazines and crime novels and he watched true crime documentaries that involved stories involving sexual violence, particularly when the stories involved illustrations or pictures of dead or maimed bodies. However, in a letter that he later wrote, he said that he never ever read fact documentaries and shuddered at the thought that anybody would. He provided different accounts of his life dependent on whom he was speaking to at the time, and this showed the level of manipulation which he was capable of. In one conversation, he described how he would consume large quantities of alcohol and go out and canvass the community late at night in search of any undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or, as he put it, whatever else could be seen. Bundy also varied the accounts of his social life. He told 2 interviewers that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He claimed that he had no natural sense of how people develop friendships. He said, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends." He also said, "I don't know what underlay social interactions." And his classmates from Woodrow Wilson High told an interviewer that Bundy was well known and well liked there. And they said that Bundy was like a medium fish in a large sized pond. But when Bundy describes his childhood, he talks about having a lot of children to play with in the particular area. And so it's possible what Bundy interpreted as a strained and difficult relationships were internal to him. He was skilled or became skilled at looking like he fitted in, when in reality, he didn't know how to develop close personal interactions. And this ability to relate to others or to understand them socially or emotionally only grew as Ted got older. The main element to his psychopathy when he later went on to kill. And as I've said on a number of occasions in the past, when someone commits a murder, it's not their first crime. Whether or not the authorities know of the previous offences or not is another matter, but it's definitely never their first crime. And during high school, Bundy was arrested twice on suspicion of burglary and theft of a car. Bundy did grow up to be a charming, handsome young man. He was very friendly, very approachable, very smiley, and people who met him trusted him. He went on to become a law school student. He'd done a degree in psychology, and that resulted to him moving to various universities. He believed he was very intelligent. However, his class friends sometimes said that he struggled to keep up with the work. He had ideas of grandiose of himself. He consistently saw others as being beneath him in some way, and he very often showed contempt to those around him. Several young girls had gone missing and were then murdered, and Bundy had managed to evade capture for some time by giving some serious thoughts as to how the police operated and how they investigated crime. He'd ensure that he left no evidence at the crime scenes that could be linked to him, and he also consciously moved around the country from state to state as he murdered, because he knew that it would be very difficult to know what had previously occurred in the different states for the police. And at that time there were no central databases, there was no computers, no fax machines. Any communications between the police forces was done via the post, via written post, which took time. During the time that he was murdering, he continued to live an outwardly normal life. He worked on political campaign trails, he had a relationship, and he was liked by everyone who met him. He was quite charismatic. He developed a skill of masking this inner darkness that he had. He'd learned how to appear to relate to others. He'd developed a skill of being able to charm other people into doing what he wanted them to do. Many of Bundy's female victims regarded him as very handsome, as very charismatic, and they were the traits which he exploited to win their trust. He would typically approach his victims in public places, and he would feign injury or disability, or he would impersonate some type of authority figure before going on to overpower them and assault them in secluded locations. And we now know that Bundy sometimes went back to the crime scenes, grooming and performing sexual acts with the decomposing bodies until it was no longer possible to do that due to the level of decomposition. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims. It's said that he kept some of the heads as mementos in his apartment. Many of them were found scattered across the mountainsides. And on a few occasions, he broke into people's houses at night and he bludgeoned his victims as they slept. He'd spoken to one of his girlfriends about his actions, and he'd said that he would follow sorority girls around on campus and that he tried to stop but that he was unable to. And he did eventually go on to tell her that he thought he was sick. And it was this girlfriend who'd rang the police to report. She thought the police should take a look at him. She didn't know at the time that he'd been involved in any offences. She rang the police and said that she thought that they should take a closer look at him. After girls had gone missing in several states, a new string of attacks would begin. He raped and he strangled an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho. And then he either disposed of the remains immediately after in a nearby river, or he returned the next day and he photographed the body and dismembered the body. And shortly after this, a 16-year-old female was dragged into a wooded area and was raped and strangled. On the 18th of October, a 17-year-old went missing, and her body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. Post-mortem examinations indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On the 31st of October, another 17-year-old female disappeared, and her body was found by hikers in Northwest America in a canyon. Both women had been severely beaten, they'd been raped and sodomised and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Amy, including how he would shampoo their hair and apply their makeup after they died. The crimes clearly had a sexual component to them, and as with many serial killers, there's an escalation in the level of violence used, and it was no longer enough to just rape. He wanted then to rape and kill. And when that was no longer enough, he began to mutilate the bodies of these women and engage in acts with them post-mortemly. He denied all of the murders at first. He was later convicted. And during earlier interviews with a journalist, Bundy was speaking of the murderer who said that must have committed these crimes, and he said, "A person of this type chooses his victims for a reason. His victims are all young, attractive women. Women are possessions. They are beings which are subservient, more often than not, to males. Women are merchandise." As far as Bundy was concerned. He then went on to say, "There is no denying the sexual component. However, sex has significance only in the broader context of a much broader scheme of things. That it is possession, control, and violent." And then Bundy says, now let's consider the possibility that this person suffered some sort of acute onset of a desire that resulted in killing these young women. How do you account for that? Bundy asked the journalist. He spoke of the individual, and he spoke of himself in the third person when discussing the crimes. He spoke of an entity within which grew and grew. He did what the entity told him to do. Bundy said the early manifestations of this condition, which is interest concerning sexual images, your standard fare that you would see in a movie house or a Playboy magazine. This interest becomes more skewed towards a specialised literature, some of it pretty grotesque, which would preoccupy him more and more. It would reach a point where anger, the frustration, the anxiety, the poor self-image, the feelings of cheated, being wronged, insecure, he decides upon young attractive women being his victims. And this is how Bundy put it to the journalist. And Bundy continued to kill and was arrested at several points. He engineered several breakouts from jail. He treated the courts and the police with contempt, and even represented himself at his own trial. He believed that he was far superior to anybody that he had to deal with. He dealt with the questioning of one of the witnesses. He proceeded to ask the witness details of what he'd found at the crime scene. A typical trait of serial killers is that they would keep mementos or pictures so that they're able to relive the thrill of that murder. And by Bundy questioning this witness over and over, it's likely that Bundy found pleasure in receiving details of the scene. Bundy treated the trial as somewhat of a show for the media. He even proposed to his girlfriend during questioning of her. The pair managed to have sex while he was on death row and managed to have a daughter. This man feels no guilt. Even after admitting his crime, he said that he was in the enviable position, as he put it, of feeling no guilt. He was extremely narcissistic and he enjoyed the attention that the media gave him. Bundy was part of the in-depth interviews that the FBI carried out to build up a picture of violent criminals. He spent time with the FBI going through other cases and his, and he would go through other cases suggesting what the other offenders were likely to be thinking and what they were likely to do next. And it was a Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who was an expert who looked at the brain chemistry of violent men, who said that Bundy was a manic depressive who had bipolar disorder. His lawyers had tried to argue that he wasn't competent to stand trial, when he did because of the public pressure. They tried to argue that Bundy wasn't fit to stand trial, he wasn't fit to represent himself because of this manic depressive condition which he had. And this would fit with the way that one of the detectives spoke when he said the way that Bundy spoke of his crimes. He said when he spoke of the crimes, he would get all excited and his eyes would go black. And one aspect of somebody in a depressive bipolar episode is very common for their eyes to go fully black, and so it is very likely that he was suffering bipolar and manic depressive episodes when he carried out these offences. Bundy only confessed to the murder in the last 3 days of his life. Bundy was finally executed by electric chair in the Florida State Prison on January the 24th on 1989. His biographer described Bundy as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control that he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. He even once described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you will ever meet. And so that just reflects his lack of empathy, his lack of remorse, his inability to feel emotion. And so in conclusion then, it's clear that Ted Bundy was suffering some sort of a mental health condition. He's been described as a narcissist, a sociopath and a psychopath. He's had difficulty relating to others because he's unable to feel love, he's unable to feel guilt, and this led to this horrific series of sexually sadistic murders which continued over some years. And I certainly believe that had he not been killed, he would have been incapable of rehabilitation. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I do hope that you've learned something additional. And again, I've not covered the crimes in as much detail because there is a massive amount of information online about the crimes which he committed. I've tried to focus more on the psychological aspects of his behaviour and how he very much treated his victims as objects, as something to be controlled, as something to be overpowered. Thanks for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next series of videos that I do.